We have 4 fabulous funders who are going to share with us quite a bit about the roles that they've been playing in supporting collective impact work, as well as a lot of what they've been learning about implementation from the funders' perspective. And so without further ado, I will introduce them. I will not take the time to read their bios, as we want to spend most of our time hearing from them. All of their bios are in the app. But to my immediate right, we have Clotilde Perez-Bode Dedecker, President and CEO of the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo. Next, we have Jocelyn Sargent, Executive Director of the Hyams Foundation here in Boston. To her right, we have Hilary Pennington, Vice President of Education, Creativity, and Free Expression at the Ford Foundation. And finally, Patrick McCarthy, President and CEO of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So to kick us off, I would love to hear from all of you a little bit about why each of your organizations has chosen to engage and or support collective impact, and a little bit about the different roles that you play. We know that you are, of course, all funders of different types, but that means that you're all wearing really different hats in the way that you engage in the work. So maybe we can just go around and hear a little bit about the why for collective impact and the role that you're playing. We'll start with Clotilde.
So we are about to turn 100 years old, and about 12 years ago, we were getting ready to celebrate our 90th anniversary. And for about 87 years, we had been a very thoughtful grant maker and taken great pains to make sure that our grants would have the greatest impact possible, all the while the macro indicators in our community continued to head in the wrong direction. So it became very evident that we needed to approach this in a new way, and given the complexities of the problems in our communities, we were very humble in looking in the mirror and saying we can't do this alone. So this predated the coining of the term collective impact, but it was about joining forces with peers across the sectors to craft shared goals and to work together to achieve shared goals, because the grant-making tool was insufficient to the task of community transformation. So our role at the Community Foundation has been a convener, a funder, a facilitator, and a general broker of the currency of this work, which is relationships.
Great, and tell us, could you also just add a little bit about the different social issues that you're supporting through these types of collaboratives?
Yeah, so in the last dozen or so years, we've maybe launched, convened and brokered about I would say about a dozen of these different collaborative initiatives, but currently we're working on increasing post-secondary completion through the Say Yes Buffalo partnership, over 200 partners at the table, and the Racial Equity Roundtable, which is looking to advance racial equity with an 8-point agenda and 75 partners at the table. And for both of those examples, we have served as the initial backbone, but always with the objective of building new capacity in the community so that the community can continue to lead this work collectively with us, transitioning from the initial backbone organization to a partner at the table.
Great, thank you. Jocelyn.
Yes, at the Hyams Foundation, we're also close to 100 years old. We're 96 years old. And our DNA really has focused on being a part of the community. We, from our inception, have valued being closely connected to communities, marginalized communities in particular, but communities of color, low-income communities across the city. And I think for us, collective action offered an opportunity to really bring community voice to the policymaking decision makers, and as well as the other leaders in the community, the business sector, to the educational institutions. And so the Boston Opportunity Youth Collaborative, which you have heard so much about, so many great and wonderful young people participating in that, as well as a number, 80 collaborating organizations, are working together to make sure that young people have the best opportunities that Boston can give us. You know, we are very fortunate to be in a community that has been on the upswing, and we've had so much progress in terms of prosperity, and we're increasing the number of jobs in this city. And we want our young people to be a part of that transformation. And we want to keep them here in Boston so that they can add their creativity and their knowledge and their experience. You heard so much earlier today about how they're bringing their own experiences to the table. So we saw that as a great opportunity for us as a private foundation that is very much in touch with the community to play a connective tissue role. We walk that line between being a private foundation and one that, you know, feels very similar to a community foundation that also wants to partner with our community groups as opposed to be in a ineffective power dynamic with them. So I think collective action really does offer that kind of opportunity. And that's where we decided to enter the picture.
Awesome, thank you. Let's hear from Hilary about the work of the Ford Foundation.
Well, it's not often that we're one of the younger ones on the panel, but we're 80 years old, the Ford Foundation. So, and we have come to work on collective impact, I'd say really for two big reasons. The first is we work on hard problems, and the second is we're a national foundation. And national foundations cannot be effective working on hard problems that are situated in places without working with partners and through local partners. So the main example of our work in collective action that I would draw from is my colleague Doug Wood's work with our corridors work, which has also focused on basically the pipeline to post-secondary education, trying to work backwards. If you say what you want is to help young people achieve that kind of credential beyond high school, then what are the loss points and momentum points? How would you design the system backwards from that goal, all the way back reaching into the education systems? So the very first thing we did, starting that work in 5 communities, was to figure out who the local funders were that we could partner with and support and follow their guidance. And then we have worked together with them with a range of backbone organizations. In each of 5 communities, it was a different one. In one place, a community foundation, in one place, a chamber of commerce, in one place, a mayor's office, but all with essential kind of work. So we helped to fund the work on the ground and then fund sort of Uber intermediary work on data and technical assistance and documentation that could provide added kind of heft to the work in the particular places and connect them to each other. So that's how we've thought about our role and some of the work we've been doing.
Great. And Patrick.
I'm sure it's clear to everyone that I'm the youngest on the panel here. Our foundation was legally started about 70 years ago, but really the modern era is only about 25 years old. From the beginning of that part of our foundation's history, we took a collaborative kind of approach. So we launched a series of national initiatives in child welfare, family to family, juvenile justice, the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, Youth Futures, the Jobs Initiative, the Mental Health Initiative for Urban Children, Plain Talk, et cetera. All of these were multi-site, we're in multiple cities or states, multi-year, multi-million-dollar initiatives. And we learned a lot about how a somewhat large, not that large, but somewhat large foundation can come in and blunder around and not do as well as we thought. And I think out of that, in more recent years, we've tried to do a lot of what you all just described, which is how do you connect to folks on the ground who really know a lot better than you what needs to happen and provide whatever the resources they need in order to move their agenda forward. Having said that, we're proud of all the work that we did and we're getting great results from some of those initiatives, but now we're doing things more like what we call evidence to success, where we provide tools to a community and to large systems to figure out which problems they want to work on. We help them figure out how to fund it. We help them figure out what evidence-based interventions from other places could be adapted and shaped to their needs. How do you evaluate them? We've greatly increased our attention to integrated data systems, greatly increased our attention to race, equity, and inclusion as part of the work, and very much increased our attention to youth voice, as well as we had always had our sort of resident voice. But we've learned very quickly with the help of youth how important it is to have young people not just at the table but in the lead. So happy to talk more about any of that.
Great, yeah, and it's really interesting to hear. We have some hyper-local funders. We have some funders who are funding in places across the country, and with Ford even some international funding, excuse me. And really interesting to see some of the different roles. Clotilde really picked up on, the community foundation really building local capacity so that over the long term you can sustain those efforts out in the community, and Jocelyn really building those community relationships. Then hearing Hilary talk a lot about, building those intermediaries to support the work and the ecosystems for collective impact to happen. And, Patrick really with the results and thinking about lifting up voice and how you can support grantees in doing that. So really interesting to see the different roles that you all are playing, as well as many of the similarities. So based on your experiences with collective impact, I'm curious to hear a little bit about some of what you've seen as the keys to unlocking the potential that it holds and ultimately achieving the outcomes that you set out to, and perhaps any lessons learned around implementation. And so for this, maybe we'll start at the reverse end and work our way back.
So there's, I sort of feel like the guy who's asked to give a speech on surviving a flood and discovers Noah's in the audience. All of you have your own experiences and responses to this question, but I suspect are at least as thoughtful, if not much more than my own. I think what we've discovered, though, is start with getting the right people around the table. And by the right people, I mean the folks who either control or greatly influence resources and those folks who are most affected by how those resources are currently used. Adapting a results frame, it doesn't have to be the one that Casey uses, but a results frame that everybody can sign on to and use as a way of using the same kind of language, agreeing what the metrics are going to be, driving down to the story behind the numbers, and then figuring out what's the contribution that that particular body can make. You can't do everything. What's the contribution toward the result you can make? We found it's very important to encourage folks around the table to make public commitments to which they will be held accountable because they've made them publicly, not just in the room, but to the broader audience. I think our focus on evidence has been a critical piece of whatever success we've been able to have, and the bumper sticker statement that progress moves at the speed of trust, relationship, and that just plain takes time. So those are a few things off the top of my head that we've learned over the years.
Great.
Well, I would agree. There's probably way more wisdom in the room than there is up here. So it'll be great when we get to the interactive conversation. I would say everything that Patrick said, and I guess I'd add one, which is the need for people to get to the place where in order to accomplish the results, once they've looked at the evidence and what it tells them about the problem, to say, I can let someone who's better at this do that thing. And that's when I think you begin to really see and believe that a collective impact effort is going to be powerful. Maybe you don't have to be the organization that's trying to provide every service. Maybe you're really good at one service, and if you do that well, you can let someone else provide a different one. So that, I think, would be one thing we have seen across our work. Jen, to your question, what might be a next edge for collective impact, or maybe some of the things outside of its sphere? I think the great thing about collective impact is that it focuses on systems and changing systems. As those of you who might have heard us speaking earlier this morning at the Opportunity Youth event, the thing about systems is that if you just work on the systems are set up to follow rules. And so in many, many ways, I think collective impact is an inside-out kind of strategy. It's working within the systems that exist in a community. But sometimes, to the point you were making, Clotilde, and you, there are things that exist like racism, like structures of power that can only be changed also by outside pressure working in. So really beginning to look at the rules of the game, at power dynamics in a community, and the underlying beliefs and attitudes that are used to justify exclusion and discrimination. And that doesn't always happen in the collective impact frame. So I think and that would get me to a second kind of lesson. If you believe that to be true and you're really thinking about inside and outside strategies, not to be afraid of those, not to be afraid of the times when there's dissent or pressure or countervailing kinds of energy. And in particular, I think that gets to the need to connect to community voice and community narrative and community action, often among young people themselves, but also people in the community. I think a lot of the people that have enough community roots to be at a collective impact table are often what can be called grass tops. And they can be connected to organizations that work with grassroots, but getting to that community voice, I think, is really critical and essential. So those would be two places, I think, where there's tension and where collective impact doesn't have to be it all or be the only thing, to your point earlier today.
That's great, and I think that really actually is a nice foreshadowing of the session we have tomorrow morning, where we'll be hearing from Marshall Gans and a panel of folks who have been doing a lot of community organizing work to really explore how those two approaches can be in conflict and or complementary to play both that inside-outside game. So that's a really great insight to bring in here and start thinking about. Jocelyn.
Yeah, I'd like to build on Patrick and Hilary's comments around this. Hilary, I'm so glad that you reiterated the statement around systems and rules and how we talk about systems change and we think about rules, but sort of separately. I think that is a tension that comes into play too often, especially when we're thinking around an issue that, well, it's not even an issue, it is what we focus on. Our strategic focus is around racial justice. And so we are taking that directly on in all we do, including our collective impact work. I think what I initially wanted to respond to, because we've been focusing on racial justice for at least the last 5 years, and we've been thinking about racial justice and systems change for the last 2 years and working on it quite deliberately with our community partners. One of the things that I think becomes a challenge is conflict. And so I just want to put that out on the table because we often find in philanthropy that groups are competing with each other. And what we try to do is we try to minimize those levels, those entryways for conflict among different groups, and we work to create safe space, as safe as they can be. I know there are probably many of you out there thinking, well, that's not how I felt, but we need to hear that, and we need to make those spaces places where you can collaborate more freely as opposed to be in conflict. So that's one thing that I think is critical to just sort of take on, and for philanthropy to minimize the degree to which groups are competing for funds and to get rid of that space to some degree. I think one of the ways to do that is by modeling. One of the things that I don't think philanthropy talks a lot about is sometimes we get a little competitive with each other. Never. Not on this stage, but so what we try to do is we try to model the fact that we are interested in collaboration, that the social problems we're all trying to work with and trying to resolve, they require more than any one institution can do, more than any one government can do, more than any one community or nonprofit actor can do. So we need to focus on collaboration, and I'll just say that just to also give a couple of examples that just occurred to me. Annie Casey recently put out a great RFP to other funders. It's Results for Impact. And so we have a team at Hyams working with the Boston Opportunity Agenda, which is also a collaboration of funders and other stakeholders. So we're actually going to use that as a laboratory to work with funders from across the country to come up with some ways to think about how do we measure impact? How do we look at impact in a way that's meaningful for communities. And also, I just want to point out that we're in so many of the collaborative efforts that Ford Foundation has sponsored. I've run across the wonderful program staff that the Ford Foundation has, and we're all working together to promote educational equity. So that's just sort of I just want to push the collaboration theme, and I want to say that we're not just asking you to collaborate, that we also are pushing ourselves to collaborate.
Great. Practice what you preach. Yes. And Clotilde.
So, this work is just so dynamic and so iterative, and it is a learning continuum. I think if the work is authentic, and if we indeed are making progress, it means we're breaking new ground, which means we are all continuously learning and renegotiating our relationships and how we come together in new ways to get to new results in our community. So for me, it's very exhilarating to be at the table. I'll never forget the first Say Yes Buffalo meeting, where we had an unprecedented group of strange bedfellows around the table. And the head of the parent group turned to everybody else and said, all right, so who's in charge? And the answer was, we all are. There wasn't a lead person in charge. And that was completely new in our community. Whenever a meeting was convened in our community, somebody was in charge. And here we were all on equal footing with no official organization per se, working on behalf of this shared goal of post-secondary completion. I think, so I would say our two biggest learnings, let me first note that I refer to the community impact, the 5 core components, as an art kit as opposed to an airplane model kit, right? This is something that will be designed and co-created differently given the stakeholders at the table and the local context of the effort, and it will look and should look necessarily different from community to community. The piece that, the two greatest learnings, I think this is really hard work. In fact, I'm fond of describing it as unnatural behavior performed by consenting adults. This is not easy work. We could all be doing our thing, everybody in their own lane, and getting through the day doing what we get paid to do. So the celebration of successes, of small and large victories, the saying goes that success has many mothers and failure is an orphan. So to the degree that you can get an early win and that you can all share the credit. I remember the first year Say Yes launched that the county executive in his State of the County address basically claimed credit for the very significant contributions that the county government had made to Say Yes. And then I went to the State of the City address, and the mayor claimed credit for all the success. And I thought, victory, right? Everybody owns it. It's that shared ownership, and that requires a lot of care and feeding of relationships to ensure that everyone feels valued, that everyone feels heard, whether residents, students, or superintendents and people that have titular positions. Takes a lot of care and feeding.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm really hearing in your response is needing to pay attention to both the collective and the impact. So the collective, the building trust and the relationships, but also the impact, celebrating the wins and the evidence.
The role of that individual in the collective.
Yeah.
It's a 3-layered cake, if you will.
Great, yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question before we're going to turn to you all for questions. So please, start thinking about what you'd like to ask our panelists. The last question I was going to pose to you, shifting gears a little bit, but we've already heard a few mentions of the current political climate here in the U.S., and we'd love to hear a little bit about how your foundations may be responding to some of those shifts, and to the extent that you see collective impact as relevant in these changes, how you're thinking about a new or changed or perhaps consistent role for collective impact work in these times. And we'll start in the middle here with Jocelyn.
Sure. I was going to say approaches like collective impact are more important than ever. And I know there's so many things, if you've been hearing, it's more important than ever to do this now. But I think what it speaks to is the need to really support and appreciate each other's perspectives and build on that, build power based on that. I think what, for us, what it's meant is really taking a look at the fact that the administration, which now is predominantly white men who, have not, I'll just understate this and say they have not pushed away a white supremacist narrative. And that's a challenge, because what we're looking at, when we look at our I love the way Tommy Chang just in an earlier panel said, it's not about dropout, it's about push out. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the things that push out, young people, particularly people of color, into less than optimal career outcomes. And so what I would say is, now I feel like that particular narrative that is being pushed forward by the administration really is at odds with what we see as the need, the work that we see needed for success for young people of color and immigrants. And so what we are trying to do is we're trying to balance and be responsive to the new context that communities find themselves facing. We're trying to hold close and tighter to our philanthropic peers who are our local peers, our community foundations. You just heard from Paul Grogan. We also work with the Barr Foundation, with Klarman Foundation. We've got Haymarket Fund, which is an incredible, public fund that has been focused on racial justice issues for forever. And so what we're trying to do is really, come together as a community and also try to be responsive to the changing and uneven landscape that we know young people of color are now finding themselves facing.
Yeah. We'll come over here to Clotilde.
Yeah, so I would underscore Jocelyn's comments. It's never has it been more important to go from symptoms to systems and to double down on our collective ability to advocate and to drive meaningful and bold agendas at every level of government. In our community, the government will always be and has always been the largest funder. And to the degree that we as philanthropic entities can influence the efficacy of the public dollar, by the way, our public dollar, our tax dollar, then I think we as foundations are really firing on all fronts. And I think the collective voice is needed now more than ever, whether it's your city government, your county government, your state government, or the federal government, that collective impact work is more relevant than it's ever been.
Great. Patrick.
So I'm not going to disagree. I think I'm going to put a little bit of a different slant, perhaps. I think if you've got a collective impact, a collective, if you will, already established and in motion, that has reached the point where it can be nimble and can align contributions in a very rapid way, then you're more fortunate than most places. But if that's there, then there is huge opportunity to rally multiple sectors to not only speak up, but actually use the influence and the power that is around the table in all those different kinds of power. It's not a hesitation, it's an and, not a but. The and is that if one follows closely what is going on that is not in the paper, or the paper, listen to me, that's not online or on whatever screen you happen to be looking at, whether at the federal level or the state level, you'll recognize that it's not just a matter of reduced resources. There are fundamental structural changes being proposed and being moved toward at a very rapid pace. And it is only because of, I don't want to downplay it by calling it a distraction, it's much more than that, but it's only because of the uproar that we have around the executive branch right now that these plans are not moving forward as quickly as they otherwise would. So what's my point? I think those of us who have built up networks that are able to influence federal and state policy ought to collaborate, we ought to align, but we ought not wait to have a series of meetings in order to decide exactly what we're going to do. This is a very quickly changing situation. We've got to move like right now. Having Having said that, what I started with, which is if you've got a strong collective already built, this is certainly the time to use the voice and the power that's there. And if you're still building it, it's not the time to stop. The reality is the action is going to be at the state and the cities very quickly. The federal policy is kind of, I hate the military analogy, but I'm challenged to come up with a better one, but it's kind of like the air war. It can destroy things quickly. But if you're talking about sort of building and holding on to territory, that's the ground war. Sorry for the analogy, but that's the slugging it out day by day, relationship by relationship, moving forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward. That's really where, in the long term, we're going to be okay, guys. We're going to be okay. But we can't forget that there is that air war going on, so we got to also be sure we're helping to protect each other.
Great.
That's great. We have been thinking in very similar ways and trying to figure out how do we support kind of in a both-and way. So I think we would strongly agree that states are where there is going, and communities are where there will be a lot of action. And because there is so much destruction happening in so many places, the great temptation is that people will just focus on their one issue. And so we feel one way we as a national multi-issue funder can help is by trying to build and support more multi-issue kinds of coalitions at the state level that can tell a story about how all of these pieces fit together and how we have to be for a unified kind of agenda. So that's one thing that we've been doing. We've doubled down a lot on our traditional work on gender, race, and ethnic justice. In our youth work and our education work, we've made a big pivot and we've taken resources away from the kinds of work that we've generally done on systems and decided to make just a big bet, swing for the fences in supporting youth organizing, recognizing that's not always going to be an easy or simple path. So a lot of work with our board to help them understand, what does it mean when you support youth organizing networks where there's not an organization that you can actually call up if a group of people decide to adopt a challenging platform, or if young people put themselves in danger by some of the kinds of protests that they are organizing. So how do we be allies for that kind of youth-led work and those kinds of youth-led movements? And then the very last thing, which is kind of in the plumbing, we've done a hard look at ourselves just as a funder, as a funding partner, and decided we're not a really very good one. Most of our grants have been project grants, and they have been 1 to 2 year grants, and we've decided we need to stop that. So we've decided our default should be to give general operating support, not project support, whenever we can. It's yeah, right? Kind of pathetic that would be a hard thing to come to. We've decided to that nonprofits have costs. It costs money to do what you do, and who are we to say we'll only give you 5% overhead or 10% overhead? So we've raised our overhead rates to 20% for all of the project kinds of grants that we give. And we are increasingly trying to move towards partnerships with key organizations that we're calling build partners, and providing 5-year general operating support for them, and really working with them to try to build much more sustainable organizations, meaning saying to them, and this is actually a surprisingly hard conversation, no, what we really want you to use this money for is to build up your operating reserves, is to pay your people better. Don't do more activity, despite the fact that because we are all addicted to doing more activity, and we've trained our grantees to say, I'm going to scale, I'm going to do more in order to get our money, and we have to stop that. So that's what we're doing. Thank you. Trying to do.
So we'd also love to hear what you all are curious about, and we have some folks with mics that are going to be roaming the room. But if you have a question or a comment about some of the topics that have come up in the panel, we welcome your contributions now. So feel free to raise your hand, and someone with a mic will come find you. I see one hand over here. And as you get up to share your question, please let us know who you are and where you are here from.
Hi, David Nevins, Bridge Alliance. I'm just curious if you have any input of how foundations might be working with entrepreneurs, corporations, creating collective impact in terms of funding outside of just foundations, but foundations working with foundations, but also business people, corporations, etc.
Great. Any of you want to speak to that?
Well, I think business leaders, better than anyone, actually understand the power and the potential of a collective approach. And you know, you have to be pragmatic about the self-interest of each organization. If you're not a mission-driven organization, or if you're a for-profit organization where marketing and recognition is important to your brand and to your ability to continue to feed your bottom line, which is profit, where our bottom line is change, you have to be very pragmatic about making sure that you create the win-win situations. But what becomes very clear in this work, and what lies at the heart of this work, is that each of us going at it alone can't get there. That we have to build these cross-sector coalitions, public, private, and nonprofit, that leverage the strengths of all the key partners from the different sectors, and also be very intentional about making sure that everyone gets what they need, like any other relationship, right? I mean, how many people in this room are married? Is that ever over? You're right? You're forever working on it. So it's the same thing. People need to get their needs met, and it's not any different for the for-profit sector. So I think being really pragmatic about ensuring that win-win-win occurs across the three sectors.
Yeah, and recently we've embarked on a collaborative experience or experiment across the city of Boston. We're at the very beginning stages. But when I think about collective impact, I think of it as the results of collective action. So you heard me say collective action. I'm a political scientist, so you have to forgive me. And when I take everything back to democracy, then I think about what every group of people has to contribute to resolving the issues that keep us from having a just and prosperous society. So I think there's absolutely a role for the business sector and for the private sector more broadly speaking, the nonprofit sector. I would be hugely depressed if I thought that something like racial justice has to be resolved by philanthropy by itself. I mean, that's just not going to work. So I take it back to that place, like, yes, there is a role. And what we at Hyams want to be able to do is we want to be in a position to be a resource for various sectors, private or nonprofit, that want to figure out how we can do this work together. So we want to be that connective tissue. We welcome that role. And so I commend you for your question, and I think it's a fundamental part of democracy, and we all have to take that approach.
There's also economic benefit for our communities, because ultimately we're talking about building a more expansive, inclusive economy where everyone will benefit.
Yeah.
I guess the only thing I would add in is these are great points. Too often I think we invite CEOs of businesses into meetings without a clear sense of what it is we want them to do or what we're asking them to do. And if you're going to really partner with folks, you've got to partner with folks at the speed with which they need to move. And as both of you pointed out, the interest that they have in whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. Their responsibility as a CEO is to the stockholders and to their employees and to their customers. And that's a pretty big space. You can move into that space pretty easily. But if you just invite them to a meeting, which I've seen happen much too often, usually because I've convened it, and say, gee, we'd really like you around the table to help us work on this, that, or the other, they're looking at their watch in 15 minutes. They're like, you're costing me money here, man. If you don't know what you want, call me when you do. So that would be just the caveat, that it really is the responsibility of the folks who've gone deep on the particular issue, whether it's education or whatever it is, that you've thought through what is it that you want this company or this CEO, this individual to bring to the table.
Yeah. And And I will just say from the Collective Impact Forum, we've seen a steadily growing number of private sector funders, so either people funding out of their core business or their corporate philanthropy, getting engaged in this type of collaborative work. So while we do see still more of the private and community foundation sectors, we are seeing more and more engagement of the private sector as a promising trend in that direction. Let's move on to a next question. Any hands in the room? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Brad Fitch with the Congressional Management Foundation. And Jocelyn, you said it all comes down to democracy, and we do a lot of work with organizations trying to encourage them to engage with their lawmakers to help them change public policy. But when we do our training, I've never encountered a group of people so terrified of engaging in advocacy, whether it's because they don't understand nonprofit rules or because their board of directors thinks that engaging with politicians is icky and something uncomfortable to do. Would you all talk about how, if it is about democracy, or as Mr. Murphy says, it's time to act, how to help this group or others overcome that fear? In fact, our training program on this is called Learning How to Hug a Porcupine, because it's so prickly and uncomfortable. How do they get over that fear and learn how to hug a porcupine?
We do a lot of work on that. We very much believe that advocacy in the political process is essential. So a lot of what we fund has to do with political participation, with voting rights, with organizing for policy agendas. And philanthropy can do way more than it thinks it can do. It can support organizations. It's one reason why we actually like to give general support, because it allows organizations to be able to be, not to have to say, I'm only going to do this tiny thing. They can do a lot to educate and inform. Obviously, they can't lobby. But there's a lot that foundations can do, and we shouldn't be shy or afraid of the political work. That's a necessary part of, to your point, of a democracy.
My answer to the question, I think, is exactly as Hilary said, and it's really about partnership. So you've got to find ways to have folks who have not yet become comfortable with advocacy partnering with folks who do it all the time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have a kind of hub and spoke kind of approach where we have a kids count organization in every single state in the country, and we have state policy, state priority partnerships along with other funders in many of the states, and partnerships for America's Children in many of the states. These are all networks. But any one of those organizations is not going to be expert on anything. So we have national experts who can be deployed to the local level, to the state level, when an issue like a tax cut proposal is on the table that might harm education, for example. So I really you can't expect folks to jump right in just with a push and some encouragement. You've got to partner them up with people who've actually done it. It's like any other kind of skill. And then it's like, oh, you mean it's just talking to people? I can do that. But unless they've got somebody, the first few times with them, I think it's tough.
And I think what we all do is philanthropy has this great ability to do something that other people can't do that often, which is we can convene. We're convening right now. And we can build capacity, as Patrick, as you're mentioning, we can build capacity so that when people different groups get to the table. We talk about this mythical table. It's like King Arthur or something, I don't know. When we get to the table, we are prepared to have the discussion. We're prepared to respect others' opinions and thoughts, but they're informed. They're not just, well, I read this morning something and I'm going to give you my first thought. But we can actually help to build capacity so that all of those groups that come to the table are in a level playing field and can have a conversation with solutions. I also was here, and I know many of you weren't, for a conversation earlier today where Governor Deval Patrick talked about, he didn't name philanthropy, but I kind of felt it. I felt us labeled as, like, sometimes we don't want to get involved in the politics. The politics are too dirty. And I think as American people, and again, this is a political scientist coming out, we have to know that the politics are ours. I mean, it's our democracy. The politics are not someone else's. And so I think philanthropy can play a great role in preparing groups and citizens and sectors and leaders to be able to, come to the place to say, not only I have a problem, but I have a solution, and I want you to consider my solution.
And I think resourcing informed decision making, because there's a lot of misinformation, and people sometimes feel organizations and individuals feel paralyzed to act because they're not sure what's the truth out there, and presenting, investing in making sure that folks, whether individuals or organizations, have balanced information and have the facts that they can then act with certainty and confidence, and then equipping them in how you do this. And it is about having conversations with the people we elect, by the way.
Yeah. Great. I see a hand over here.
So hi, I'm Juhi Ren with the Santa Fe Community Foundation. Just build on that a little bit. I really appreciated the idea that the Collective Impact Coalition can be kind of a nimble, ready partner to this policy work. But Collective Impact Partnership often embodies coalition of members who may stand on different sides. So different from being an activist or organizer, when you stand on something with a stance, how do you balance being a neutral convener and having that capacity as a long-term trusted partner for policy discussions versus having kind of a reactive action as a nimble kind of solution on particular policy change that happens right now? What does that capacity look like?
Well, I would say, first of all, we're not neutral, because neutral says you don't have a stand. And our organization is very clear, we believe in this versus that. Having said that, in the role of a convener, I think we, again, need to be pragmatic. And we need to find where we can come together so that we can move forward collectively on those fronts. And there are plenty of things that cross aisles, and certainly in our community, that we can move on, such as racial equity and post-secondary completion. Who's going to stand up and argue against that in public, right? So to the degree that we can find powerful aspirations that make sense from an economic standpoint, from the third poorest city in the country, economy resonates, and opportunity and growth and potential resonate in our community. That is really important, that we as conveners find that common ground that we can move collectively on, and it may not be everything when we're talking about a coalition where we have diverse perspectives at the table.
Yeah, I think there's this opportunity when there is, at least initially, a difference of perspective. It really is this bringing all the information together. And so I have a board that I consider to be the best board in the world. This is being taped and shown, right? So
You have to argue with
yeah, I know. So we have 4 of the best boards in the country, but one of the reasons I value our board is that it's made up of folks with quite wide-ranging points of view on the political or ideological spectrum. And when sometimes staff get frustrated about, well, why don't we say this, why don't we do that? I say, look, if you can get the folks in our boardroom nodding, you can get America nodding. And if all you're looking to do is to get folks who already agree with you to nod, just go to the mirror. Don't bother me, I gotta get everybody else nodding. So if you've got that kind of tension in the group, it's really a wonderful opportunity to see if you can get America nodding by finding out, all right, so what is it about how we see this differently, and what information are we missing, and how do we open our own minds and say, well, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's really the work, right? But again, I will say that in this current time, that's what I meant when I said an individual organization may not have the time to do that if you've already been very clear about your position. It's not time for 3 years of conversation. It's time for investment and moving.
I really appreciate that question. I think you're putting your finger on a really essential, really hard thing. Because yes, there will always be things that people agree on, and you probably do want to stay focused on those. But I think probably for collective impact, you have to be really clear on what those values are, and you probably need with each other to hold that common space. and not feel like people are going to run out of the room. And also, you know, and this gets to the tension between the inside and the outside. So I appreciate you naming that, because I think that's real and hard and probably very particular to issues and places, how you handle it. Yeah.
And I think that inside-outside strategy is really critical for the health of our communities and for the change that we all want to see. We need both. And we need both to be robust in order to really drive change. And we won't always agree on the inside. The inside and the outside strategy shouldn't be completely aligned, right? They should be complementary to the degree that a little pressure never hurt.
Right.
Here in the back.
Yeah, great, way in the back.
Hi, I'm Mark from Portland, Oregon. I run a social venture partners in Portland. And I'm curious, especially for the national funders, as you look at this crowd, we're mostly representing a bunch of localities that are doing collective impact. What strategies have you used to find those that can most effectively use your funding? What sort of are the connectors in the pipeline or the deal flow for your grant making? And maybe those of you who are representing localities there in Boston and Buffalo, what does that look like for you in identifying the grassroots or the collective impact strategies?
Well, you know, I think we've learned lots. We've made more mistakes than we've had successes on that issue. And to me, the very rarest thing, and the thing that I wish happened more, things work best when communities or networks of common interest organize themselves around that interest and they approach us rather than the other way around. You know, most of the times when we've had an initiative and we've set out a request for proposals to communities to participate in an initiative like that, it causes a really dysfunctional kind of thing because, and when we have bright ideas like the local community has to match whatever our initiative is, what that can end up doing is taking money away from other things that they were working on that they actually should still be working on. So I feel like the partnership would be a lot more productive if you guys expected more and you demanded more from us and you had more standards for what you would say no to or challenge us back on, rather than you know, any national funder collaborative is necessarily always thought to be, you know, a good thing to try to turn yourselves into a pretzel to participate in. So that's a hard, you know, I don't think any of us are very good at working on both sides of that equation, but that's what I wish we did better, and I wish we saw it more from local communities.
So our foundation actually has two places where we're more the local foundation. One is our hometown in Baltimore, and the other is Atlanta, where UPS is headquartered, and they're both our civic sites. So we literally have teams of people on the ground who are often in conversation with national funders and others. So we're kind of both the victim of as well as the perpetrator of assault with a friendly weapon. You know, I think one of the things we've taken away from this is exactly as Hilary has said. We've finally figured out after 25 years that you can't, as an outside funder or any outside institution, quote, go in, because you never really do go in, but go into a community and build capacity or provide some kind of blueprint for what they and 6 other sites, or in one case we did it with 22 other cities, ought to do. It doesn't work. I'm absolutely convinced that it doesn't work. Instead, we've got to find places where there's momentum, where there's a locally led initiative, and ask ourselves and them the question of, is there something we can add, in most cases as a junior partner, and we're working in Buffalo as a junior partner to an initiative that has a lot of momentum behind that. Having said that, I will give one exception. This is a 3-beer conversation. If anybody's interested, I'll buy the first one. I think that I suspend that rule, or I would suggest suspending that rule when what you're trying to accomplish is a system-level change of a particular system. And what I mean by that is if you're trying to make it less likely that a child welfare system puts kids in congregate care and forgets about them and leaves them there, or a juvenile justice system locks kids up, is just 2 examples. Our lessons have been that actually you have to be fairly clear on what it takes to make it happen. And you know, I'm not afraid to use the word prescriptive. We now have 25 years of experience with lots of successes where we can say, if you do these 10 things, you will get this result. If you do 9 of them, you might get the result. If you do 8 of them, much less so, et cetera. So if you want to work with us, we're happy to fund you, happy to work with you. But if you're serious, you really are going to have to, and here's the long list of things, including youth voice, including the risk assessment. You know, and people, I don't want to do the risk assessment. Well, it's not going to work. You don't do the risk assessment. So that's the one thing I would hold back. I worked in systems for most of my pre-philanthropic life. Sounds like a Tyrannosaurus Rex, close to it. And I can tell you that an outside funder coming in with a very clear idea of what it takes is extraordinarily valuable politically, financially, and just tactically in a way that it is simply not with a community change initiative. They're two different beasts. So.
That's a great insight. And, Patrick will be at the reception this evening for the 3 beers for anyone who's interested. We have time for one more question, and I do see a hand in the back. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for sharing all this knowledge with us. My name's Steve Haggerty. I'm the mayor of Evanston, Illinois. And a couple hoots for Evanston, I hope. All right. There must be some Northwestern grads in this crowd as well. I'd be interested, you know, we think a lot about funding, right? I mean, there's big initiatives. Obviously, there's foundations out there. There's only so much the governments can do. There's only so much we can do in terms of raising locally. I'm just curious on your thoughts of social impact bonds and, you know, sort of a relatively new tool here in the United States, and what kind of, you know, pros and cons of those, and what kind of long-term impact do you think those can have when it comes to some of these big initiatives that folks in this room have?
I don't know enough.
I'll take a shot. Yeah.
Okay. Take a shot.
So a couple challenges. One is that social impact bonds are being used in a broad way for everything that's related to pay for success. And the challenge is that in the US, at least, where true social impact bonds have been used, so far we haven't figured out whether they get the results that we want to get. In some instances, because of the way they were early on structured, more of the resources flowed to the private investors than were necessary in order to make it a viable proposition. So that's one problem. The other is they lend themselves to programmatic interventions around a very specific result that you can track progress over time, which is perfectly fine, but it's often in areas, specifically criminal justice and juvenile justice, where the problem is more systemic than programmatic. And so if you don't figure out how to stop locking up the wrong kids, having the kids who are locked up being exposed to some program is not going to drive the numbers down. You might be able to say, well, you know, fewer kids who are locked up than recidivated. That's a perfectly fine thing. But if you keep cramming them in the front door, you really haven't changed anything. So what I'd like to see us do is a pay-for-success model that brings in the kind of systemic changes necessary, married to the programmatic changes necessary, funded primarily, frankly, from foundations and other endowments, and not from for-profit investors, at least in the early stages, in order to drive deeper results. But it's an extraordinarily complicated field. I think, from what I can tell, that we are gradually getting smarter and smarter about it. So I think the pioneers are to be congratulated and encouraged, and we ought to push on. We're not there yet, but I think each time a deal is made, it looks a little smarter than the last deal. So.
The only thing I would add to that, it's hugely controversial. I like the idea of it because basically if you make upstream investments, they pay off later on, and that just seems common sense. And so it kind of it's a challenge for me that has to become a whole complicated thing. I think the only thing I would add to Patrick's analysis is that, and you said this actually, you know, for where you see results, it's just in a very limited set of social problems. So one that's really big is recidivism. I mean, so it's clear in pay-for-success models or social impact bonds that involve re-entry that the payoff comes really quickly. You see the recidivism rates go down quite dramatically, quite quickly. What I'm concerned about is that we don't capture those savings and then go back and invest them in the right places. And because we have the for-profit investors engaged in the model, they get the benefit. And society really, to me, it's just, how do we orient ourselves into just the common sense thinking that you make the early investment, it has a longer term payoff. And so that would just be all I added to that.
Great. Well, with that, I would love to ask the audience to please help me in thanking Patrick, Hilary, Jocelyn, and Clotilde. Thank you.